introduction drug education workshop thing, and I'm going to be talking about how recreational drugs affect certain neurotransmitter systems in the brain, how to avoid dangerous drug interactions, general drug safety tips, and how to nutritionally mitigate the wear and tear and depletion that comes from the party lifestyle. So, a little bit of an intro on how I got here to where I am now. It all started with sort of my own quest to conquer my personal struggle with depression and anxiety. And I got my bachelor's in biology from San Diego State. And so I had the scientific background to be able to read a lot of neuroscience literature trying to understand my own brain chemistry. And basically, in my earnest desire to be healthy and happy and thriving all the time, I became obsessed with neuroscience, specifically in researching the pathology of mood disorders such as depression and anxiety and things like that. And happy to say I was quite successful in my endeavor, and I made huge changes to my brain chemistry and my health and my livelihood, and I no longer struggle from depression and anxiety. And if I do feel myself getting pulled in that direction, I have very powerful tools now to quickly mitigate it and get me back to a state of balance. So basically, there's a lot of crossover between the neuroscience of mood disorders and sort of promoting brain health and resilience as well. So you could probably see the connection to recovering after a party all night and recovering from depression or anxiety, because they have a lot of similar underlying mechanisms for the pathology of a brain that's unwell or inflamed or imbalanced and such. So basically, through my discoveries of all this amazing neuroscience literature that's out there, I ended up starting my own nutritional supplement company based on the years of research that I had been doing, going to neuroscience conferences, online courses, neuroscience books, symposiums, and just reading a bunch of neuroscience literature online. So my company is called EntheoZen, if any of you are interested in learning about it. But basically, I cater mostly to mood enhancement and brain health, and I also have a party recovery supplement that we just recently launched as well. So enough about that. Well, sleep deprivation is probably the number one thing that we're all experiencing, at the burn especially. I know right now for myself quite a bit. Overstimulation, there's a lot of cool shit to look at out here, and it's very stimulating and kind of exhausting to be exposed to for hours and hours and days on end. Overexertion, we're all biking and walking and moving quite a bit, and we typically aren't drinking enough water or eating enough food. So all of these things put us kind of in a state of stress, which is hard for our brains and body to deal with and cope. And a lot of times when people put their bodies through this tremendous stress, when we return home, we feel like shit, right? So all of those things I just talked about end up leading to oxidative stress on your cells, which inevitably leads to inflammation, which leads to cellular damage ultimately, and the depletion of a number of neurotransmitters and antioxidant molecules and nutrients that your body really needs to function optimally. So what happens when we experience all this? Well, we feel tired and grumpy, brain fog. Sometimes we're irritable, or we're actually in physical pain. If your joints are hurting, that's because your body is in an inflamed state because it's trying to cope with the amount of oxidative stress that you're going through. And if you're not sleeping or eating adequately, your body is struggling to create the molecules to neutralize that oxidative stress with antioxidants. So, I'm going to give a quick little neuroscience lesson. I'm going to try to make this as digestible as possible, but I think it's important to show you a little bit so that it all makes sense. So, Neuroscience 101. First, I'm going to draw a neuron or a brain cell or nerve cell, any sort of cell that's in the nervous system. Forgive my bungee cord in the middle of this. Sorry if I'm blocking it as well. So this is like what a neuron looks like, and this is like the cell body, and this is the nucleus where the DNA that sort of gives directions to the cell on how to be a cell and what to do, what proteins and stuff to make. And these branch-like structures here are called dendrites, and they reach out and they connect to neighboring cells to send electrochemical messages to send messages through your nervous system, basically. And on the ends of these dendrites, there's something called synapse, and they're these tiny little clefts that are really close together, but they're not quite touching, and they end up releasing neurotransmitters onto the next cell to carry forth the message. So, in order for a neuron to be activated and send an electrochemical message, it needs to be stimulated and create something called an action potential. And what happens is a neurotransmitter, which I'll talk about more later, will bind to a receptor on a synapse, which is located on a dendrite, and it'll create a electrical current that goes through the cell like this. This is called the axon. It's like an insulated long wire, essentially, that helps conduct these messages so that they can travel through long distances in the body and brain. And the message goes all the way to here, and then this end of the axon releases neurotransmitters to perpetuate the message to the next cell. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a domino effect that just passes the message along, like telephone in a way. So I'm going to go over a few of the main neurotransmitters. There's actually a bunch. There's probably over 100, and by definition, a neurotransmitter is just a molecule that plays a role in communicating in the nervous system. So I'm going to talk about some of the big ones, the most relevant ones to recreational drug use especially. So first we have glutamate. And glutamate is incredibly important. It's the most abundant neurotransmitter in the entire body, and it's basically responsible for activating neurons to create the action potential that sends messages throughout your entire body. And it's largely important for learning and neuroplasticity and memory and just overall nervous system function. It's incredibly important. So we also have GABA. And the reason I bring these two up first is they're kind of like the yin and yang of the nervous system, in that glutamate is excitatory and GABA is inhibitory. So these two kind of do a dance together in our bodies to decide when it's time to activate a neuron and when it's time to suppress activation of a neuron. If these two are out of sync, you can have overexcitation of your nervous system, and you can also have underexcitation, which is a depressed nervous system. So these two are constantly at play with each other, kind of this push-pull effect of trying to maintain homeostasis depending on what your nervous system needs you to be doing at that point. So, also going to talk about serotonin, many people's favorite. Serotonin is largely responsible for feelings of calmness and well-being and peace and safety and happiness and euphoria. About 80% of our serotonin receptors are actually in our gut, which is really interesting. So it plays a huge role in regulating digestion and appetite, as well as sleep and mood. I'm sure many of you have noticed the phenomena that when you take a drug that has some serotonin activity, you usually have to purge very quickly. So serotonin, and then we have dopamine, another one of everybody's favorites. Dopamine is responsible for a lot of motor control, cognition, reward circuitry, and things of that sort. It's sort of states of arousal. It's a lot of the times dopamine is related to drugs of abuse, which I'll talk more about later. And these two, serotonin and dopamine, end up sort of regulating glutamate and GABA in the end. So it all comes down to glutamate and GABA, again, having the push-pull effects, and serotonin and dopamine kind of mediate those responses. So when an axon is activated by glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, a bunch of calcium flows into the cell and releases free radicals into the cell, which is why we have a natural sort of oxidative aging process in our bodies. We're constantly being oxidized, just like a rusty fence or something, but our body makes antioxidant molecules to neutralize these free radicals so that we don't rust, essentially. So it's a natural sort of occurrence for us to have oxidative damage in our bodies, and that's part of how we age, and then we, eventually die. So it is possible to have glutamate overstimulate your nervous system and end up releasing a bunch of these free radical compounds, which is increasing oxidative stress. And what happens when you have a bunch of free radicals floating around, they start to actually damage the cell, create inflammation, and destroy neuronal structures, and even cause total cell death. So, I'm gonna erase this. So say here's does anyone actually know what a free radical is? Yeah?
Shit that your body has to clean out.
Sort of, yes. Yeah? Yes, there you go. So, electrons like to be in pairs, and a free radical is basically, so I'm going to draw an M for a molecule. This is not an actual, periodic table symbol I'm using. So, this guy has a sole, lonely electron, free radical, and this guy wants a buddy. So he's like, I want to be in a pair. I want to be a pair of electrons. I'm going to go find somebody else's electron to steal so that I feel happy with my pair. So this molecule then finds some other molecule that may be part of the cell membrane or structure and steals its electron so that it can be a pair. But then now this guy only has one electron. So now it's a free radical. So it ends up being this perpetuating chain of stealing electrons and basically damaging the tissue by rearranging all these electrons, and it ends up destroying parts of the cell. And our body has mechanisms to repair this sort of regular damage that's happening on a daily basis. But when you have more damage than this, when you have more damage than you do resources to repair it, that's when you start to have brain cell atrophy and damage to dendrites and synapses, which inevitably leads to kind of a loss of neuronal connections. So say we start having dendrites shrivel away and die because of oxidative stress and damage, then we now don't have as many terminals for this cell-to-cell communication to occur. And a lot of what some of the recent research is suggesting, especially with mood disorders, is that it may not be about having low levels of serotonin or dopamine after all, though those things are associated and may have some sort of contributing factor. But we're starting to realize that inflammation is probably the driving factor, and inflammation is a result of oxidative stress, because when you have all this damage happening, your body says, oh no, we have to go and repair this. And so it sends all these cytokine immune molecules to go fix the tissue damage, and then they get a little bit overly ambitious and end up kind of doing more harm than good. It's just like when you break your ankle and it swells up. That's your body's normal inflammation process. And so we ice your ankle to stop it, because if it's swollen, it actually ends up damaging the tissue more. So your body does the same thing in the nervous system. It goes, oh, we need to help, and it ends up kind of damaging the tissue even more. So, yeah, when we, like I said, when we are overstimulating ourselves and we're not sleeping to replenish antioxidants in the body, we're unable to really neutralize these free radical compounds. Bear with me here. There's a little bit of an antioxidant myth. People say, oh, eat antioxidant-rich foods, that will neutralize free radicals. Well, they're right in some sense. Eating antioxidant-rich foods is incredibly healthy, but it's not necessarily directly because they are neutralizing the free radical compounds. They've actually discovered that really what these antioxidant molecules do is they activate epigenetically, meaning they interact with your genes that actually code for the pathways to make antioxidant endogenous molecules in your body, such as glutathione, because realistically, our bodies produce way more antioxidant than we could ever really consume in our diet. So really, when we're consuming antioxidants to help with oxidative stress and inflammation, it's because they're upregulating these pathways in the body that create antioxidant molecules to neutralize these free radical compounds causing oxidative stress and inflammation. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the drugs. Woo!
So, question.
Based on what they most predominantly affect, but keep in mind that they're sort of promiscuous a lot of times and end up interacting with multiple systems at once. So, first I'm going to talk about serotonergic drugs. Serotonergic. I'm probably spelling stuff wrong, but okay, so MDMA is probably one of the most well-known ones. And then we have the classical psychedelics, such as LSD, mushrooms, DMT, ayahuasca, ibogaine, those sort of things. And then we also have a number of synthetic serotonergic drugs, such as 2CB, DOB, 2CI series, NBOM, all sorts of interesting analogs. There's a bunch of them out there. And then we have the dopaminergic drugs. And that's mostly including cocaine, amphetamines and methamphetamines, opiates, and sort of indirectly nicotine as well. And I'll go into detail more about all of these individually. Then we have GABA drugs, such as alcohol, Xanax, GHB, Valium. A lot of the anti-anxiety drugs are GABA agonists. And then we have glutamate. Sorry, this is glutamate. A lot of times, drugs that target glutamate receptors are actually blocking glutamate activity. And some examples of these are ketamine, nitrous, and PCP, which no one seems to do anymore these days. And then I will briefly mention the cannabinoids, or the endocannabinoid system, which is basically, cannabis compounds, THC, cannabidiol, and then we have the synthetic spice cannabinoids as well. So, serotonergic drugs. So MDMA ends up blocking the reabsorption of serotonin into the when it's in the synapses back into the cell, creating a surplus of available serotonin to bind to your receptors and create a euphoric feeling of abundant serotonin. What's interesting about MDMA is it's actually a type of amphetamine, and normally amphetamines are traditionally dopaminergic drugs, and in fact MDMA does still incur dopaminergic activity, but it's sort of unique in that drug class because it predominantly affects the serotonin system. When you consume MDMA, about 80% of your body's supply of serotonin is released into the synapses. So it actually uses quite a bit of your resources to produce the effect, which is why you feel like shit the next day. The psychedelics, LSD, mushrooms, these are what you are called serotonin agonists. So these molecules are shaped very similarly to serotonin, and they actually fit into serotonin receptors and mimic the activity of serotonin. So that's sort of a difference between MDMA and the psychedelic drugs. Is MDMA actually dumps your whole supply out into the synapse, and it causes depletion the next day, rather than the psychedelics fit into the receptors, mimic serotonin activity, which is why you don't feel quite as drained the next day after using a psychedelic versus MDMA. We also have the synthetic psychedelics, as I mentioned, 2CB, 2CI, 2CQ, whatever, DOB, DOH, Sasha Shulgin made a lot of these. And then recently we've seen something called N-Bomb, which is an LSD analog, come onto the scene and is often sold as LSD, but it is not LSD, and it's not as safe as LSD, and it's not as thoroughly researched as LSD. I would sort of advise caution when using the research chemicals. I went to a psychedelic science conference a few years ago, and I went to a talk by Dave Nichols, who's one of the world's leading pharmacologists on psychedelic drugs, and he was supposed to give a talk on LSD pharmacology, and he decided to change his talk subject to research chemicals. And basically the moral of the story was there's not enough research on them. They are neurotoxic and they do cause fatalities in people. So he said, use them with caution. And I figured if this guy was telling me to be wary of the synthetic analogs, then maybe that's a good sign to stay clear of them or exercise caution when experimenting with them. So dopaminergic. Like I said earlier, dopamine is largely involved in reward circuitry, which is why, if you notice, a lot of these drugs are addictive. And what these drugs end up doing is releasing or blocking dopamine in the synapse, so they're binding to the receptors, creating a euphoric effect, and it basically reinforces the behavior by making the person feel good. So they continue to do cocaine, they continue to do meth, they continue to do opiates, or they continue to smoke. Dopamine is actually neurotoxic just naturally. Although it's a neurotransmitter, it ends up metabolizing into a free radical compound in the body. So when you have drugs that are releasing a lot of dopamine, you're actually creating more free radical compounds, creating more oxidative damage and possibly more inflammation and cellular damage. So a lot of times people with chronic cocaine, methamphetamine, or opiate use tend to have substantial brain changes and damages and inflammation because they are constantly releasing these free radical compounds just from the basic dopamine metabolism. GABA. So alcohol, I put alcohol in this category because it largely affects GABA, but alcohol is a bit of a slut. It really interacts with all of these systems, and that's one of the reasons why it's kind of dangerous to mix with anything. I mean, even on its own, it can be dangerous. It's pretty toxic. Xanax, GHB, Valium, all of these things, when you activate GABA, you're inhibiting the nervous system, and you're basically suppressing action potential in a neuron, which can lead to depressed respiration and heartbeat, which is why people, especially if you're mixing, alcohol and GHB, can end up, stopping their heart or stop breathing, and it can be very dangerous. All of these things have the potential to be fatal if somebody overdoses on them. The glutamate drugs, ketamine, as I said earlier, typically these drugs block glutamate activity, so they end up inhibiting action potentials from glutamate binding to receptors. Some examples is ketamine, nitrous oxide, and PCP. So I'll quickly tell you which one of these are toxic. So MDMA is actually pretty relatively safe, but it is slightly neurotoxic because of the fact that it does release some dopamine molecules into your synapse. So for that reason, it creates oxidative stress and has the potential to be neurotoxic. But like I said, it's not predominantly dopaminergic, so it's less neurotoxic than, say, these purely dopaminergic drugs. The psychedelics are non-toxic and non-fatal, and again, they don't use up your body's own supply of serotonin, so they're much more sustainable as far as being able to replenish your supply and what your body needs to maintain homeostasis. All of the dopaminergic drugs are toxic, in part because of the dopamine activity that's being metabolized into these free radical compounds. And the GABA drugs, for the most part, all of these have the potential to be neurotoxic and deadly. Glutamate blocking drugs, ketamine, it's slightly neurotoxic in its own way, but it's not nearly as much as the MDMA or the dopaminergic drugs. And nitrous oxide is non-toxic, but if you're huffing a lot of it, it can definitely deplete your body's B12 surplus. So make sure to supplement with B12 if you're huffing on a bunch of nitrous. And again, PCP, but no one really does that anymore these days.
What's the reason for that?
Probably because it's not very fun. Or maybe I just don't hang out with the right people. I don't know, but I don't know anyone that does it. See, Adderall? So yeah, Adderall would be in a dopaminergic, because it's an amphetamine. So yeah, Adderall, this is dopamine. Alright, this is a nightmare. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about drug interactions. Sorry. So, just guessing, which drug do you think has the most drug interactions? Yeah, alcohol. Like I said, alcohol interacts with almost all of the neurotransmitter systems, so it really kind of messes everything up and complicates things. And alcohol also, along with MDMA, actually inhibits enzymes in your liver that are responsible for the degradation of toxins and things in your body. So what happens with MDMA and alcohol is, normally when you take a drug, you have a curve, the drug peaks and then it wears off like that, right? So with MDMA and alcohol and a number of other substances, but I won't go into that, the curve is more like this, and then it kind of stays up there for a while because it's inhibiting your body's ability to break down these molecules that are in your bloodstream, which kind of just keeps accumulating and leads to a very skewed bell curve of your peak and your metabolism of that substance. So for that reason, it's quite dangerous to mix MDMA and alcohol with other toxic substances. And for the most part, the dopaminergic drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, they are also extremely dangerous to mix because they are neurotoxic and they do have fatal doses. So if I had to very broadly say which drugs not to mix, it would be anything that's dopaminergic, and alcohol. And MDMA, again, shouldn't be mixed with alcohol or dopaminergic drugs. Though there's a few drugs that MDMA seems to be safer to mix with, but for liability reasons, I won't tell you to do anything that's safe. Because what is really safe, anyways. So there's also a number of pharmaceutical drugs that can be really dangerous if you're using recreational drugs, and especially selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they're also called SSRIs. They're largely prescribed for depression, and how they work is here's a synapse on the end of a neuron. So your synapse gets an action potential and ends up releasing a bunch of serotonin or whatever neurotransmitters into this cleft that then bind onto this next cell and then propagates the message. So what happens with an SSRI is in normal brain activity, whatever doesn't get bound to this cell gets recycled back into the first neuron and used for later to release again. With an SSRI, it blocks the serotonin reuptake and traps these serotonin molecules into the synapse to create an abundance of serotonin to bind to the receptors, thus making the person feel happier, in theory. But the problem with this is if you never recycle them back up into the cell, your body just now has a deficit and has to make twice as much. And if the underlying issue for your depression is that you're not making enough serotonin, well, you're kind of just like digging a deeper hole for yourself. So for me, this is a problem that I see in the sustainability of antidepressants. So how is this related to recreational drugs? Well, MDMA and other drugs also have SSRI type of activity. And so say you're on an SSRI, you're blocking reuptake into the cell, you have an abundance of serotonin trapped into the synapse. So you add MDMA to the mix, you're taking an SSRI. Now you have two different drugs that are collectively blocking this reuptake of serotonin and creating an abundance in the synapse. The problem is you can actually have too much serotonin in there, and it creates a very serious condition called serotonin syndrome, which can lead to severe, brain damage and even death. So it's very serious that if you're taking pharmaceutical drugs, you should be very careful if you're taking recreational drugs as well. Another pharmaceutical drug to be aware of is monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme in our bodies that is responsible for degrading monoamines, which are basically serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, melatonin, all those really important neurotransmitters. It's your body's way of regulating how much is sort of circulating through the system so that you don't have too much or too little or whatever. So MAOIs inhibit this enzyme from degrading these neurotransmitters, which ends up elevating the supply of neurotransmitters available in your body, which is cool. It makes you feel happier, maybe, because they are prescribed as antidepressant medications, though I feel like they're starting to move away from those because there's so many drug interactions with MAOIs. But basically, it's a very similar mechanism to how I just explained the SSRIs. Except with the MAOIs, not only are you trapping serotonin in here, you're also trapping dopamine and norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters. So you're now complicating it, and you have the potential to have a toxic level of these neurotransmitters that can cause really severe problems for you. So MAOIs are another one to watch out for. There are some cases when MAOIs are actually very useful. I'm sure many of you here know about ayahuasca, and it's traditionally been used in conjunction with other serotonergic psychedelic molecules such as, DMT in the chacruna plant, or even mushrooms or things like that. You can combine with an MAOI, and when done under supervision with, a particular diet and such, it's relatively safe. So I would be careful with SSRIs and MAOIs if you are taking any of the dopaminergic drugs, opiates, nicotine, MDMA. Well, MDMA is serotonergic, but basically all the ones that I described as being neurotoxic, you should be very careful because they have the potential to overload your system with too much neurotransmitter. Also, you have to be aware that a lot of our drugs are adulterated, which is an unfortunate result of the fact that it's a black market, essentially. A lot of MDMA has bath salt type compounds such as methylone, which are highly addictive and toxic and pretty dangerous, and there have been a lot of deaths associated with those molecules. There's also piperazines, methamphetamines, and synthetic research chemicals that are sold as other drugs. So be wary of that. So now that I've scared you guys, let's get to the part where we can actually make sure that we're safe and feeling healthy. So one of the best ways to know what you're consuming is getting a drug reagent test kit. And they actually sell these at dancesafe.org is a really great resource to buy these test kits for yourself, and you can bring them to events and see what you're taking and make sure it's what you want to be taking. So dancesafe.org is a resource for that. Also pillreports.com. It's a database where you can actually type in, the color, the press, the quality of the pill that you have, and you can see what other people have written about that pill, and sometimes people even have reagent kits that they've tested the pill with to see what it is chemically, so you can decide if it looks like something that's clean enough for your preference or whatever. Also, ecstasydata.org is another great resource similar to pillreports.com. One of my favorite rules is if it's bitter, it's a spitter. LSD is tasteless and odorless, so if you take something that's supposed to be LSD and it has a strong bitter taste, it's probably not LSD, and it could be a dangerous research chemical, so I would, try to spit it out quickly if you realize it's not LSD. And then another sort of general common sense guide is try not to mix drugs. Like, I know it's fun, we all like to do it because it makes things more interesting, but please be mindful of how often and how much drugs you're mixing, and especially what kind of drugs you're mixing, based on what I just taught you about dopaminergic drugs and neurotoxic drugs and drug interactions and things of that sort. So, how to recover from all of this? Well, so obviously common sense, drink lots of water, get electrolytes, get some sleep, eat healthy food. Yeah, that's like no-brainer, right? But I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how you can actually provide the precursor molecules to help your body replenish these depleted neurotransmitters and really combat the oxidative stress and inflammation that's happening and wreaking havoc on our nervous systems. So, amino acids. A lot of our neurotransmitters are actually created from amino acids that we eat, and amino acids are chained together in proteins. So when we eat protein sources, we get a bunch of amino acids. There's also a bunch of supplements that you can buy for individual types of free-form amino acids. Tryptophan and tyrosine. So tryptophan in the body gets converted to 5-hydroxytryptophan, also known as 5-HTP. Any of you guys heard of that? Yeah. Yeah. So 5-HTP moves through the blood-brain barrier when tryptophan does not. So your body has to turn it into 5-HTP to get it into the brain where it can be converted into serotonin. So 5-HTP gets turned into serotonin, and then can actually later on get turned into melatonin down the pathway. Tyrosine is a precursor to not only norepinephrine but dopamine as well. So I haven't really talked much about norepinephrine, so I'll just stick to dopamine. Tyrosine gets converted to dopamine eventually. There's other steps through the process as well. Unfortunately, if you're vegetarian or vegan, it's really hard to get these amino acids from plant sources. It's not impossible, but they are most abundant in animal protein, such as meat, eggs, dairy. So if you're vegan or vegetarian, sometimes you can be deficient in these things or struggling to get an adequate supply of it. But if that's the case, don't worry, you can actually buy supplements of these amino acids. So if eating animal protein is not an option for you, there are other ways to do it. Another important group of nutrients, B vitamins. So B12, B6, B1, B3, B9, niacin, folate, all those things, they play a really crucial role in neurotransmitter production. So if you're deficient in these, your body's going to struggle to make enough neurotransmitter, which can lead to you feeling depressed or irritable or anxious or just exhausted. So B vitamins. Another molecule that plays a huge role in neurotransmitter production is magnesium, among other minerals that act as cofactors and enzymatic assistants to help convert the amino acids to their respective neurotransmitters. So if you have the amino acids as your starting point, but you're deficient in B vitamins and magnesium and other essential nutrients that you need to actually turn them into a neurotransmitter, then it doesn't get carried forward and it kind of just gets metabolized through your body and you're not really making enough neurotransmitter. So as I mentioned also, antioxidants. So any sort of fruits or vegetables, dark leafy greens, blueberries, a lot of herbs are very potent antioxidants. Pretty much any natural unprocessed food really has some degree of antioxidant support. And again, like I said earlier, it's not so much that these antioxidant molecules are necessarily neutralizing free radicals directly, but they're actually stimulating your endogenous response to create antioxidant molecules such as glutathione to effectively neutralize these damaging free radical compounds. Some of my favorite antioxidants to use are blueberry, I guess I don't have to write it down, turmeric is a great one, spirulina, milk thistle, ashwagandha, rhodiola. There's an abundance of plants and herbs out there that have amazing antioxidant support abilities. And then we have something really interesting that comes into play called neurogenesis. So actually up until the late 90s, early 2000s, which is not that long ago, the neuroscientists thought that you were born and then you're a baby and you grow all your brain cells and then you stop growing brain cells and that's all you get. And so all the nights you spend binge drinking or getting concussions or whatever, you're killing brain cells that will never be restored. And that's what they used to think. But that's actually not true now, thankfully for us. We now know that there are certain specific areas of the brain that are creating new stem cell neurons even into our adult years, and those are the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb. Olfactory is responsible for smell sense. So there is a molecule called BDNF. It stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and basically it is a neurogenic growth factor. So this protein actually promotes the proliferation, differentiation, and maintenance of neurons. It's largely responsible for repairing and regrowing neural structures such as dendrites and synapses that get damaged from our daily wear and tear or oxidative stress and inflammation that's happening. And it also helps create entirely new neurons in the hippocampus and olfactory bulb as well. So what's really interesting about BDNF is they found that a lot of things that upregulate this growth factor have huge therapeutic potential, especially in treating mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and actually a number of neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's, all sorts of diseases of that sort. Because ultimately, in a neurodegeneration, state or disease, the dendrites and synapses and neurons entirely are being damaged at a faster rate than they can be repaired, and so your cells start to die out completely and you start to lose brain cell tissue, which creates atrophy of certain brain regions, which is what we see in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and things like that. So some things that upregulate this growth protein, it's actually really cool because a lot of things do it that are really easy to access and are free and healthy for you. So exercise upregulates BDNF, and meditation upregulates it. Listening to music, fasting, and then there's a number of foods that they found upregulate BDNF. Yes?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? Yeah.
Repeat which one?
The list of things that
Yeah. So exercise, meditation, listening to music, fasting, and a number of foods such as turmeric, blueberry compounds, and yams. And then there's a bunch of drugs that actually upregulate BDNF as well, such as the psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, those things, and ketamine as well. They found actually promote the sprouting of new dendrites and neural structures. So, what they told you in high school about, drugs are bad, they kill brain cells. Well, it's not entirely true of all drugs. The psychedelics actually promote growth of new neural networks and healthy brain tissue regeneration. Yay! We can justify it now. Also, interestingly enough, SSRI, like I said earlier, they're really finding that things that promote this growth factor are really effective in treating mood disorders. So there's a lot of speculation that perhaps SSRIs are effective for some people, not because of the serotonin activity that they're creating, but the fact that they're upregulating this growth protein and creating neurogenesis and repair of these neural structures. So that's an interesting theory that's going around right now, is that maybe we need to throw the whole serotonin concept out of the door because it's I think more of a symptom than it is a cause. And then quick little last note, try to avoid inflammatory causing foods, especially wheat and dairy and sugar. These things cause oxidative stress and inflammation in people mechanistically, regardless if you have like a food sensitivity to it or not. They just interfere with your body's ability to make antioxidant molecules and actually promote something called glutamate excitotoxicity, where you basically have too much glutamate binding to your cell, overexciting your cell until it kind of short circuits and fries out and causes a bunch of damage. So Burning Man's all about decommodification, but as I said earlier, I do make a product that has a lot of these things in it that is targeting these exact mechanisms that I just described, basically filling in nutritional gaps by providing the precursors, targeting oxidative stress and inflammation, and upregulating these neuronal growth factors. So there's a lot more people here than I have available, which I'm really sad about, but I have somewhere, I have a box of, is it? There we go. I have a box of some, if any of you would like to take one home with you. It's just like a little, it's just a gift from me to you guys. I guess you'll have to fight over them because, again, I kind of am running low, so I'm so sorry that I don't have one for everyone. But these little packets, they come with 6 capsules, so you can share them with your friends or just take them over a couple of days. And then if you want to refer to any of the information that I gave in this talk, I have these little cards, and there's a QR code that you can scan with your smartphone, and it'll pull up a web page with the online text version of this talk, so you can read through it at your own pace if you missed any information. And I'm also having this videotaped right now, so I'm going to try to put this up on my website as well. So that's all I really have to say about that. I also have business cards if anyone just wants to get in contact with me. I love to talk about neuroscience and nerd out, and I'm always happy to answer any questions that I can, or just chat and exchange, energy and what's that? I will write it down. Again, I'm trying to be sensitive to making this about decommodification, but there's a lot of information on the website as well that's just meant to be a gift for people to stay healthy and happy. So the website is called EntheoZen.com. It looks very similar to the word entheo.